Okay, excellent. So, good afternoon, everybody. So, welcome to this event of the UC Berkeley Critical Theory program. My name is Mario Telò, and I teach here at UC Berkeley in classics, comparative literature, and critical theory. It is an immense pleasure and honor to welcome back Jack Halberstam, who is a friend of this program and of many who are now attending. After Professor Alberstam's talk, there will be a Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, please say so in the chat and I will call on you. So I want to thank Jack for so kindly and generously agreeing to be with us today. Uh, Jack Alberstam, professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, is one of the most influential critical theorists in the world. Jack's work has been profoundly inspiring for many of us. It has had the power to change people's lives, the way we see and are in the world. Though most of us are familiar with Jack's work, I would like to take a moment to celebrate Jack's many foundational books. Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Duke 1995, takes the interpretation of Gothic monsters in Victorian literature and in film beyond psychoanalytic accounts, revealing the unpredictable complexities of the visceral affective reactions related to fears of sexual and cultural otherness, including racism and anti-Semitism, that various embodiments of literary monstrosity generate in audiences. Female Masculinity, Duke 1998, is an indispensable classic of queer and trans theory. As the review in Lambda Book Report put it, it is an extraordinary and studied work that presents an analysis of gender and more specifically masculinity without oversimplification or narrow definition. In the words of one reviewer, in a queer time and place, NYU Press 2005 is an audacious project that puts transgender identities and queer subcultures center stage, guiding the reader through case studies that run from the murder and mythologizing of Brandon Teena through British comedy films like Austin Powers to lesbian and transgender punk music, to drag kinks, to contemporary visual art, all of them animated by a methodology that is exemplary in its reach and its meticulous application. Another classic, one of the most important books of theory ever written, The Queer Art of Failure, Duke 2011, is an attempt to think about failure through, in Jack's own words, alternative ways of knowing and being that are not unduly optimistic, but also not mired in nihilistic critical dead ends. Jack offers this brilliant theorization of failure as queerness and queerness as failure, flitting deftly, as Alison Carr has noted, between the complex theoretical paradigms of queer Marxist and radical feminist thought and the number of eccentric artifacts of popular culture, including Finding Nemo, of which Jack offers a dazzling reading. A supreme example of Jack's unique ability to make rigorous theory accessible while experimenting in a quasi Bakhtinian way with various genres of writing inside and outside academia. Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, Be Compressed 2012, is an exquisite and exhilarating retheorization of feminism which Ariel Levy from the New Yorker called a provocative and pleasurable romp through contemporary gender politics. And then Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variance, University of California Press 2018 is a gem, an illuminating, fun, and lyrical theorization of transness, which everybody should read, academics and non-academics, queer as well as straight people. And finally, just out from Duke, in the wonderful series Perverse Modernities, with Jack edits with Lisa Lowe, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, is already one of the most important academic events in 2021. I want to end by reading the last words of this formidable book, which offers us a brilliantly ambitious conceptualization of the wild, boldly and compellingly inviting us to question well-established categories, including queerness, and to consider new models of disidentificatory becoming or unbecoming for desire, sexuality, race, and humanness as such. This is how Jack leaves the reader after a riveting theoretical tour de force. Jack says, wildness is neither utopia nor dystopia. It is a force we live with and the way of being that we are organizing out of existence. If the wild has anything to tell us, it is this: unbuild the world you inhabit and make its relentless commitment to the same, ignore the calls for more, and agree to be with the wild, accept the wild, give yourself to the wild, and float or drown in its embrace. So we are all very eager to hear Jack speak on an aesthetics of collapse. So without further ado, let's warmly welcome Jack Halberstam to UC Berkeley.
Wow, thank you, Mario. Really, honestly, truly, thank you for that beautiful and thorough introduction, and for all of your invitations to be in conversation this year. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all for being here in the weird non-space of Zoom. To speak about Gordon Matta Clark's work as part of the Arcus Prize, which allowed me to write an essay on a topic of my choosing and then come and deliver it at Berkeley. And while writing that essay, I got very interested in the photography of Alvin Beltrap. And I'm sure there are lots of people here who knew Baltrop's work very well. And I really didn't know it that well, and only sort of found my way to it because he made these gorgeous images of Gordon Matta Clark's masterpiece, Day's End. And his photography in the Piers has mostly been written about sort of in relationship to Gordon Matta Clark's erasing of bodies from the scene of the Piers, and Baltrop was sort of raised. His photography was really championed by Douglas Crimp, who said, that there was a sort of opposition between the desire to completely push gay male sex to one side, and then on the other hand, these amazing photographs by Baltrop of gay men cruising in the crumbling piers in the 1970s. I wasn't pleased with this opposition, and I wrote about this in the piece that I wrote on architecture. And since then, I've really decided to return to Baltrop's work and move beyond the photographs that he took of Gordon Matta Clark, because it seems to me that when we only look for the gay men in the photograph, who are indeed very often there, and they are indeed very often having sex somewhere in the photograph, we're missing some of the drama of the photograph that can be seen in the collapsing architecture itself. So for this piece, I thought, what if we actually paid attention to collapsing architecture and looked within those modes of collapse for a different way of thinking about the erotic, right? And this makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, the piers were themselves a kind of erotic terrain. it wasn't only the fact that gay men were having sex there that made it an erotic terrain. There's other material at stake in, you know, the way in which girders are crossed, the way in which a building is collapsing but not completely fallen down, and the way in which the building interacts with both bodies and the water of the Hudson. So I decided that I wanted to dig into an aesthetics of collapse. So that's what you're going to hear about today. And I am going to share my screen because obviously I have tons of amazing images for you. And we start there. This is what we're going to make our way to, however. By the end of the essay, we're going to return to this Ursula Le Guin quote, where she says in The Dispossessed, "Those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to unbuild walls." And this is the main character in The Dispossessed, talking about the role of the anarchist is to unbuild walls, which, if you know about the work of Gordon Matta Clark, you can read this as a kind of commitment to the anarchitectural. And this sentence will make a lot more sense by the time we get to the end of the piece. Okay, so let's start by thinking about collapse. To my mind, the aesthetic of collapse is all too relevant in the moment that we're living in, a moment of plague and ruination. And so as these three little images bring together, there's the trespassing of the relationship between animal and human that has brought us COVID. There's a sort of other epidemic of predatory lending that has led us to a particular convergence of speculative capital and debt. And there's also the right-wing, the rise of right-wing authoritarian leaders that have led us to a moment that we might want to think about in terms of collapse. But this moment of collapse has to be compared in the work that I'm doing to other periods where collapse really defined the urban landscape. And so we could think, for example, and this is very relevant to the work that I'm going to show you in a moment, both by Gordon Matta Clark and Alvin Beltrap, and later on, Pauline Oliveros. In the 1970s in New York City, buildings regularly fell down. And while Gordon Matta Clark in his diaries talks about the collapse of buildings as part of the sort of precarious infrastructure of the city, of course, there were landlords up in the Bronx burning buildings down in order to collect insurance on those buildings. So it was easier for them to burn the buildings down, get rid of the residents and the renters, dispossess those people, and then collect the insurance on the buildings. And that's the beginning of a particular cycle of real estate and insurance scandals that we are on the other side of. For those reasons alone, it's interesting to go back to the 1970s. So the way that I would situate this work then in terms of capitalism is to say that capitalism is a sort of ongoing fantasy of more and excess, profit and surplus. But what collapse reminds us is that this must necessarily be punctuated by loss and less, debt and deficit. And of course, these negative currencies are not the opposite of capitalism, but they themselves are simply alternative forms of speculation, as the 2009 recession showed. But that said, we, in this boom bust economy, tend to think only in terms of the boom and never seem quite prepared for the bust. So what I want to do is find in collapse itself, in the aesthetics of collapse, not just an alternative to boom bust economies, but the possibility that the collapse, the fall is telling us something about the unsustainability of this particular mode of capitalism itself. At the same time, instead of remedying the boom part of the economy by building more and moving towards a new boom, by remedying bust with boom, to my mind, if we look into the aesthetics of collapse, we see that the alternative is to figure out how to unbuild the world. And I know that sounds grand and ridiculous, but that really was a kind of aesthetic and political project in the 1970s. And for those reasons, it behooves us to go back to the 1970s and see what was happening in relationship to these various unbuilding movements. Unbuilding was a key term for an architecture projects that were clustered around Gordon Matta Clark. And many social theorists like James C. Scott have proposed that if high modernist architecture fused spatial order with social control, then the implication is that in collapsing architectures, can we find a vision of post-control ecologies? Okay, so that's one of my big questions. And so turning to the spectacular images taken by Alvin Beltrap of the Hudson River piers in the 1970s, I'm going to locate an archive of urban collapse viewed through a queer lens and tuned to vibrant, erotic ecologies, systems that include, but are not limited to, human contact. Okay, so this is a very typical Baltrop photograph, and I just want to linger on it for a moment. It's, you get a particular, shall we say, there's a form to collapse that's readily available in a lot of Baltrop's work. It's not just a pile, of rubble. There's a way in which the building is coming down, but is not down. And that ability that he has as a photographer to capture the fall is deeply interesting to me. As in most of his photographs, there is a small speck of gay male sex in the very center of the photograph. And he often finds in his viewfinder, the two male bodies are just usually a speck of flesh in the middle of steel. And you can see in the middle of the photograph, there's just two bodies at any rate. I don't know if they're white, but they're at least glowing differently in the light than the collapsing architecture around them. And it's this ability that he has to open onto the frame of the collapsed architecture while keeping an eye on these human bodies. That's part of his aesthetic that we might want to register. But the other piece of it is that the human bodies are minute. You often have to kind of seek for them. They are demonumentalized, if you like. Gay male sex is there, but the eye has to cover a whole other set of activities rather than just go straight in a pornographic way to the scene of erotic contact. This is not jouissance. This is not a glossy porno. This is the banality of human contact in the middle of a much larger ecology. For people who don't know, Alvin Beltrap lived from 1948 to 2004. He was an African-American photographer who did a stint in the Navy and served in Vietnam. And then in the 1970s and 80s, made his way over to the West Side piers and began to take photographic portraits of the men that he met, and portraits also of the piers in this post-industrial moment of collapse. The term collapse, Mario, I'm sure could tell us, it comes from the Latin col and labi, so col meaning together, labi meaning to slip. And I like this idea of an aesthetic that captures the way in which some things are falling together. There's a kind of happenstance, improvisational quality to that, but there's also a different understanding of community in this idea of everything sort of coming down together. It means things falling together, a fall created by a loss of support. It signifies failure on the one hand, and the total dysfunction of a system. So what is Baltrop photographing then in these, these incredible sort of panoramic images of a series of collapses? These gestures that are available from the close reading of his photographs skew away from making, building, improving, and instead gather up the beauty of decay, and collapse and disintegration. And I'll give you the opposite of that later on after we've looked at some of these photographs together. I do think we could think of, other artwork that is also interested in collapse, like Rachel Whitehead, for example, the infamous sculpture that she did in 1993 in London, in which a whole house had to be sort of dismantled around this plaster cast to leave just this mold of a house that cannot be lived in. And her work was really commenting on the intimacy of domestic violence, the frozen state of the family, the unlivability of the family home. But it was a very controversial piece, and people really railed against having this whole building pulled down. But the really important piece is what we don't see in the Whitehead sculpture, which is that a building was dismantled around it in order to leave this this mold. So I'm interested in these dismantling projects and the abstract way in which they're reaching for social critique, as opposed to, say, a portrait of a woman and a man sitting together. What work, we might ask, do these much more abstract renderings of space and housing and buildings, what work do they do? And what can they tell us about a much broader understanding of erotics that moves away from the spectacle of two gay men engaged in sex? Just to sort of, just to build on this a little bit, it's important that for us to also see Baltrop's work not only through a queer lens, but also in relationship to Black queer culture, both of the 1970s and as it develops in the 70s and 80s through various kinds of queer vernacular cultures. So it's interesting then to think about the way in which collapse folds is part of queer vernacular Black choreographies. And so I want to talk about this in relationship to voguing. And I'm not going to go into this too much, but for any of you who have even seen a little bit of contemporary voguing performances, you'll know that the money shot of contemporary voguing is what's called the suicide dip. And that's where the queen falls back, their whole body falls back onto the ground, landing on a bent leg. And this is called the suicide dip. And if you look on YouTube, you will just find a million of these videos where you get this like pumping beat house music, and the queens are voguing, and then it's almost like the beat, at a certain moment, the beat stops and the bodies fall to the earth. And dancer and dance theorist Anna Martine Whitehead, in an essay titled Expressing Life Through Loss on Queens That Fall with a Freak Technique, examines what she calls the relationship between Blackness, queer vulnerability, and the mechanics of movement and dance. Her essay, she proposes, uses anecdotes to make an argument for downward movement and concaveness as movement techniques and responses to the physical threats intrinsic to Black ontology. So here now, collapse becomes something more than just the environment within which some, anonymous gay male bodies are having sex. Now we're being asked to think about collapse as a kind of metaphoric structure through which to think in terms of a threatened and precarious ontology of Blackness, what some theorists are now calling a para-ontology, Calvin Warren and Marquis Bay, for example. So thinking about falling, failing, and catastrophe as it emerges through the Black dancer's love-hate relationship to gravity, but also to conventional technique. And so the collapse here is a refusal to hold the pose of a conventional sort of very white ballet culture. And I've written about this a little bit in relationship to Rite of Spring in Wild Things. But Whitehead really takes this a step further, arguing that in this fall, this suicide dip, she suggests freedom is the moment of recognition that collapse is not only inevitable, but critical as well as continuous. Freedom is the moment you might have fallen, but have everyone convinced otherwise. We do not stop collapsing. Okay, so we have now, in this let's call this a repertoire of collapse. We have the collapsing piers that take up way more room than the gay male bodies having sex within them. We have a Black choreography in which the body, rather than trying to escape gravity, gives itself over to gravity, and in the process sketches out something that we might understand as a Black para-ontology. And there's much more in the Whitehead that I won't go into, other than to say that she connects the fall of a woman from a slave ship to the Vogue suicide dip, asking us to think about this, the meaning of falling across a wide range of Black cultural expressions. I think it's a really powerful piece and a really powerful way of thinking about this suicide dip. Again, the dancer, when they collapse on themselves in this way, sort of collapse onto one leg on the dance floor and then extends the other leg out into space, forming with their body a letter or a code or an alphabet, spelling out a complex message of loss, flexibility, risk, and survival. And so it's through that lens, if we can accept that these particular choreographed gestures that embrace collapse might be part of a kind of Black aesthetic, then now I think we can turn back to Alvin Beltrap and start looking a little bit more closely at his work. Okay, so let's dig into some of Baltrop's work. Really like this piece I use just as a sort of introductory piece, because it really gets at all the elements of Baltrop's composition, if you like. We're asked to look at a male body, and a male body that is half naked, what's more. And in this image, you can see that with a spray paint can, the guy has sort of blacked out a part of the wall such that he's left in place a kind of this image of a leaking phallus that hangs over him. At the same time, to his left is this gaping hole, a hole in the structure. And we're asked to look through this hole onto the empty space of the warehouse. And I think that this is a kind of instruction on how to see space in Baltrop's work. He's sort of guiding us through space and through these wounds in the architecture. Here's a good example of the way in which the body is located in space, almost always in the very center of the photograph, giving rise to a sense that the body has, the human body is sort of sculpting the space around them. But then you realize, because of the scale, that in fact the body is overwhelmed by the architecture within which it appears. The human is not at all in control of this scene, but is in fact sort of controlled by it. The grandeur, the way that I think about it, is that the grandeur of the architecture constantly emphasizes the smallness of the human and the inconsequentiality of human sex, right? So the sexual interactions are fairly inert, and that they're not passionate necessarily. They're not particularly pornographic. They are images that you see as a voyeur from a very long distance. So they give onto a practice of voyeurism, but they are diminishing, which is an interesting technique in the arena of masculine desire. Okay, just think about that. I will come back to it in a moment. What does it mean to diminish male embodiment and masculinity in relationship to these cavernous spaces? There's a kind of invagination of the space, if you like, such that the phallus simply can't compete with the openness of the space within which the bodies move. Okay, so let's just hold on this image I'll let you look at this image for a moment. This is, again, a very typical Baltrop photograph. He's way more interested in the sidings of the pier than he is in the two figures upon it. And it's only, by accident, in a way, that your eye picks up the two men. They are not necessarily engaged in sex here, and we really can't tell what they're doing. And therefore, the bodies are in relation and in conversation with their surroundings in some other way. That remains sort of a question for us to ask and answer. Now, when I was thinking about like, well, okay, what am I looking for, in this, not just in these images, but in this period? And I kind of found an answer. Here's another one. This is, let's add to our vocabulary for Baltrop. This is a way in which he gives us access to the pornographic scene of encounter, in this case, a blowjob. But A, the phallus is hidden, and B, the bodies are crisscrossed by the girders, again, reminding us of the fallibility of the phallus, and that, giving us a sense that the organizational logic of the photograph is elsewhere. And it's in these odd lines, these strange geometries of steel and flesh, collapse, girders and timber, buildings that are not made to do anything or hold anything, that serve no purpose, that give nothing to capitalism, that have no market value. All of that, I believe, is available to us in both the emptiness of some of the landscapes, and in the precarity that we see in these other images, where it seems as if this is actually a space that is unsafe for human activity altogether. Okay, so it was by going back to Cruising Utopia, because I think you can probably tell that I'm torn between a kind of utopian project of going back and finding something better, and a dystopian project in which I'm saying, and then all of this just leads us to a kind of crappy future that we can never get out of. So in order to try to think more about this project of going back, I want to work with this method that Jose left us with from Cruising Utopia, where he says, my approach to hope as a critical methodology can best be described as a backward glance that enacts a future vision, And I kind of find in this something of my project that wants to find in the 70s, and all of these different projects from the 70s that were queer in really, really different ways than the work that came later in the 1980s that were way more figure-based, if you just think about someone like Mapplethorpe. I want to go back, take this backward glance to see what future vision from the 70s we have ignored. Okay, can we go back to the 70s, a pre-internet era, after all, an era when New York City was falling down, a moment when real estate culture was gearing up, as Gordon Matta Clark's work showed, but had not yet reached its critical pitch. Can we see in the unbuilding and collapsing aesthetics of that moment a furious kind of, anti-political activity that was busily trying to unmake a future that people could sense was bearing down upon them? And what other future vision do these aesthetics of collapse and unbuilding offer? Munoz, for example, was interested, as am I, in Ray Johnson's Nothings. And I know nothing doesn't seem, well, what's that got to do with collapse? But actually, the nothing was set up by Ray Johnson in opposition to the happenings that Alan Caporal and others were creating in New York at that moment. Instead of the happening, Ray Johnson would stage nothings. So it was it's a refusal of the market logics of aesthetics, where the happening is a something and is a congregation and offers itself to art history through the pulling together of bodies and projects. The nothing is a refusal. It's a refusal of the market as the market begins its relentless capture of artwork. And these nothings are, they are something, they are a kind of a refusal that is part of the queer utopian practice that Munoz is drawn to. Now, at the same time, and this is where I part company a little bit with Munoz, Munoz writes, queer utopian practice is about building and doing in response to that status of nothing that queer people feel has been assigned to them by the heteronormative world. Okay, and that you can hear in that a very typically reparative approach that's so endearing about Jose's work. And I think, you know, he was writing in a different moment. And I think now we have to push away from that reparative gesture in favor of digging into the nothing, making something of nothing, agreeing to not meet, agreeing to not do, agreeing to not offer things to the market. And maybe then we can find some of the space of nothing that Johnson wanted to open up. And by the way, in Munoz's own book, he also, despite that reparative urge and the utopian urge to build and to world make, Munoz himself digs into the nothing through his recounting of the life and death of Fred Harco. And this is a chapter that was quite controversial when Cruising Utopia came out, because Fred Harco was a dancer who killed himself by, you know, jumping using a perfect jeté out of a friend's window. And people accused Jose of romanticizing suicide. But what he was really doing was trying to, you know, think about the possibilities of nothing and make an aesthetic out of nothing. So using the concept of surplus value to frame acts, work, and modes of being which exceed capitalist flows, Jose used Harco's leap into the void as a queer repudiation of Yves Klein's staged leap. You know, this is the heteronormative. It's the staged leap into the safety net, that Harco uses no safety net and instead leaps out of a friend's apartment building on Cornelia Street in a gesture that Munoz reads as reckless, useless, childish, nonsensical, and therefore anti-capitalist. It literally refuses all that capitalism and capitalist notions of time have to offer. So it's into, you know, it's, you could, if you think about Baltrop, in the wake of Harco's leap in the late 1960s, this commitment to collapse and to falling and to jumping makes more sense. So I'm saying that Baltrop's work should be situated within this queer tradition of nothings. And in these spaces of nothing, he also documented slow and meticulous and beautiful processes of collapse in this weird pre-AIDS moment. Like Gordon Matta Clark, he did pay homage to the non-monumental quality of collapsing piers, but unlike Gordon Matta Clark, he did not try to eliminate gay sex from the piers, and instead offered a scaled-down version of it that didn't privilege human over non-human materiality, and that reveled in messy, sculptural, chance-based architectures of collapse. This is one of the only images by Baltrop that he actually gave a name to, by the way. Most of the photographs have no title. And I believe that this one doesn't even have any gay men having sex in them. So we get a title and no gay men, and it's called The Piers, Collapsed Architecture. And it was, we don't know the date. So this notion of collapse was significant enough to him that he gave the title to the photograph. Let's look at a few more of these. This one is an amazing photograph that goes on the cover of his book, because there's in the center again, you see the two men fucking. The one on the left even has a leather jacket on, so there's a sort of human animal element. But the part of the structure on the right seems to be actively falling in on the main structure and pushing it down. So this is even though in fact everything is probably completely stuck in place, this is an amazingly dynamic image. And in the background, you have this unfolding order of New York City behind the collapsing architecture of the piers. So the piers are literally commenting on the building and the gentrification that is going on all around it. And that for sure spells out the end of the piers as well. So I'm looking for a kind of almost an intention that is almost available in the architecture itself. This is another similar piece where there's almost like a Frank Gehry fold in the middle of this bit of the pier where the pier is literally falling into the water. More importantly, that fold, I think, is super interesting, and it points to the process of decay. Trans architectural theorist Lucas Crawford, in another Arcus Prize essay that was published just last year after mine was, talked in their essay about the crumple. And I believe crumple would be the right expression for that collapsed fold in the middle. It's like an architecture where sun and wind and weather and water is shaping the building from without and pulling it down. And in the process, we get this absolutely incredible structure. A few more. We often see a lone figure in Baltrop's photographs, but always interacting actively with the architecture. And often, as in this image, framed again, as you saw in the first image that I showed you, by an open window or a hole in the wall, at least at any rate, some gaping space in the structure itself. Sometimes torsos are cut off by the architecture. So here there's half a torso. There's no particular concern for the whole human body. We don't know very often in Baltrop's photographs whether the body is alive or dead. And again, the windows are not operational here. They are simply spaces for the interaction of the architecture and light. There are images, again, where the human body is part of the debris on the floor, and the photographer is not distinguishing between trash, plastic umbrella on the right, some, cardboard boxes, glass on the floor, and a human body also strewn on the floor, so that there's a calling attention to the way in which bodies are being sort of, in a way, wasted by the city and pushed into the piers, into these spaces where the police don't go, and where the city has literally abandoned these spaces to informal economies and dispossessed communities. And then in this one, I love this image, which is looking down on one of the concrete piers as it juts out into the Hudson. But the slant makes it seem almost as if the bodies will slip off, into the water. The bodies are not particularly secure on this concrete space. And so this is a really interesting angle from which to look at human bodies and in all of their impermanence. And the impermanence and transitoriness of the human bodies versus the concrete structure upon which they sit or lie. And here is, of course, again, by now, very typical. We see the two men having sex, and it does sort of evoke that Bassani or Edelmanian notion of complete disregard for the other. This is not about intimacy, passion, romance, right? This is a kind of functional act. There's a, casual, you can see to the left, there's a bicycle that's also sort of rutting up against the building, so that there's a whole sense that the erotic is everywhere and is not particularly present simply in the relationship between the two men. So I'm trying to sort of suggest that in these tiny spectacles of two men having sex, Baltrop reinforces the idea that we're shifting away from phallic architecture that is erect and holds its shape. And we're moving instead towards anti-patriarchal scenes of detumescence. The art world, on the other hand, thrilled to these kinds of pneumatic, I would call them Viagra images of phallic puppies that are always blown up and will always stay up, right? That's the fantasy of Kuhn's work. These pneumatic inflatables are all about inflation and erection, both of which have a kind of economic sense to them as well. Baltrop instead captures deflation, impotent architectures, spaces that fold down into areas that are uninhabitable for humans. And at the same time, there's a kind of withdrawal from real estate, of buildings from real estate, a withdrawal from the market, from value. There's an architectural quality to the non-value of the scene. So Baltrop, we could say, is capturing the disintegration of property, the dereliction of architecture, the anarchitectural process of ruination. Okay, so why dereliction? And I'll move through this section a little bit quicker. I see that we're going to run out of time, so I'll skip my third section. But dereliction is, in a way, gives rise to a kind of political project that emerges from thinking in terms of this aesthetics of collapse. The Invisible Committee tell us that it's only from the destituent standpoint that one can grasp all that is incredibly constructive in the breakage. And if we turn to the work of Cameron Roland, I think Cameron Roland, a Black conceptual artist, is really the heir to the collapsed architectures of Baltrop, as well as to Gordon Matta Clark's work in his piece, Fake Estate. So let me just tell you a little bit about Cameron Roland. In Depreciation from 2018, Roland, echoing one of Gordon Matta Clark's works from 1975, bought an acre of land on Edisto Island in South Carolina in order, and this is a commentary on the post-emancipation period and the supposed bequeathing of 40 acres and a mule to former slaves, when in fact, as we know, slaves got nothing and had no resources, former slaves, in order to insert themselves into this rapacious capitalist order. So Roland buys this acre of land in South Carolina, a space that had been a plantation, in order to withdraw it from market dynamics and reduce the value of the land to nothing. And Roland does this repeatedly. He puts liens on museums like the Institute of Contemporary Art, for example, in London, is a rented space. And he put a lien on the space against the holding in the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. There's a lot of mahogany that, as his research shows, was gathered through the slave trade. And so he puts a lien on that mahogany that will eventually reduce the value of the ICA in London to nothing, So this is the work, if you like, of depreciation. So here we are again back in the framing of nothing and the leaching of value, which can be understood as part of a long and often queer Black aesthetic tradition of reassigning the use value of a given object or opposing cultural norms around capitalist behavior. Okay, and we're back to the nothing and the nothing works of Gordon Matta Clark, who in 1975, just to tell you the history that that Roland is referring to, Gordon Matta Clark in 1975, in a piece called Fake Estates, as a commentary on real estate, bought a bunch of what was called gutter property in New York City. And these were little bits of land that no one had claimed in the city. And he bought them so that they could never be used, to remove them from the market. Okay, so we can think about this history of depreciation alongside the aesthetic of collapse. And here's a beautiful image by Baltrop that, it captures one of the cuts into the piers that Gordon Matta Clark made in Day's End. But underneath it, you can also see a naked gay man who's in the very center of the picture again, who's cruising. You can also see the collapsed West Side Highway that led to the piers being so off limits, and a kind of abandoned car that's probably serving as a house for someone. All of this is sort of gathered together in this Baltrop frame. Okay, I kind of want to switch gears for the last part of my talk then and say this, surely this aesthetics of collapse, destitution, this critique of the market cannot only be about male bodies moving through space, right? So I'm going to just end then with two examples that come from, oh, well, I better say this piece first. This is David Hammond's homage to Day's End that just went up on the West Side. But what my point about de-emphasizing the gay male sex is to say that in a contemporary context, we can see the danger politically in investing too much hope in gay male jouissance and gay male cruising, because cruising, as we know through Grindr, has quickly been uploaded as an algorithm and turned into one of the most lucrative forms of capital accumulation in the world using dating apps. So gay male cruising is not at all going to be the route to a kind of critique of capital on the one hand, and to a queer aesthetic refusal on the other. So to finish this piece out and then move to a conclusion, I just want to actually play you a clip from a movie about two girls on the run that was also set in the piers, just so that we don't think of the piers only as a gay male space, only as a space filled with male homeless people, men cruising for sex or drugs, men entering, making homes there or leaving. Times Square is a film that, it's a kind of mainstream flick in many ways, although it had no success at the time. It was released in 1979, so right in the period we're looking at. And it was made by the guy who had released Saturday Night Fever, Robert Stigwood. So it had good backing. It had an amazing soundtrack, including Piss Factory by Patti Smith, I Want to Be Sedated by the Ramones, Talking Heads, Life During Wartime, and so on. It should have been like one of the great queer films of the 1970s. And I actually think it was, but no one saw it because people hated it. And it was panned in the New York Times and it never got anywhere. In the chapter of my book, I read it alongside Born in Flames to talk about these revolutionary feminist films made in 1979, 1980, deeply engaging the ruin of the piers, but using that space to forward a kind of feminist project. And in Times Square, we have two teenage girls who are on the run from the police. From one of the girls has a father who's working for the city in gentrification and real estate. And the other one is on the run from social services who want to put her in a home. They call themselves the Sleaze Sisters. They dance in Times Square. They are friends with the pimps and the hookers all around. And for them, their happy space is, guess where? The piers. And here they are in Pier 56. And I think this may be one of the only film clips we have left of the piers, because I don't even know how they got permission to shoot there, honestly. But it's a beautiful, the scene I want to show you is a beautiful utopian scene in which the two girls use the piers to voice their love for each other and to occupy this collapsing space in a queer and feminist way. So here's the clip.
Let me look. Fuck a Roberto. Back porch. My bad. Never see. Why didn't I realize it before? God, let me see it. Don't you realize this is it? This is the place. Show you, watch this. Hey, blood. Now give me yours. Come on, don't worry. I ain't gonna hurt you. Just relax. That's all. Now, I want you to listen to me. You ever feel like freaking? You get panicky, shaky? I want you to call my name. Just scream it. Scream it as loud as you can. You know, like this. Pammy! Pammy! Nikki! Louder. Nikki! Pammy! Nikki! Pammy! Nikki!
Wow. Just love this clip so much every time I see it. And to see the peers both from inside and from outside. And then to hear the way that the girls use the peers as a kind of echo chamber for their affirmation of each other, and it's a beautiful scene. And they do exchange bodily fluid. In this case, it's blood. You couldn't show such a scene today, and you wouldn't show it in an AIDS moment either. But the mingling of the voices in the peers is sort of the erotic encounter that I'm trying to get at, that is embedded in this idea of collapse. So just to bring this home, I can't do Paulina Oliveros, but there's a whole sort of chaos thing in Oliveros. But I want to end then where we began, which is those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to unbuild walls. And this is Ursula Le Guin's character Shevik from The Dispossessed. And here I'm hoping that I can kind of deliver on the promise of dereliction, collapse, and dispossession. And the way that it comes out in Ursula Le Guin's book is that for those of you who don't remember, this is 1975, this book was released, and it's still one of the very few sci-fi novels built around an anarchist society, okay? And in the plot is that Shevik is a physicist who has a theory of simultaneity that is so important that the capitalist planet, from which the anarchist planet has split off, the capitalist planet say to Shevik, hey, come and share your ideas with us. So he goes off to the Earth-like capitalist planet. He's amazed at all of the opportunities that he has there. He gets paid. He has ownership of his work. He's drinking. He's meeting women. He's buying clothes. He's doing all kinds of things. And then he loses faith completely in the capitalist project. The book reminds us of the power of the anarchist community. And he's contacted by an underground group. And the underground group asks him to address them. And this is what he says. He says, we know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand we reach out, your hand, is as empty as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give. And that, I believe, is that empty-handedness, which you can see finally in this choreographic gesture by Boy Child, which is a hand dance to no music. It's an a cappella hand dance. That gesture of the empty-handedness is where I would like to end, giving you nothing. Get back to Zoom. All right. Sorry, that was long, but not too long. Thank you, Mario. I can see you. That's nice.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was
All right.
magnificent. It was breathtaking. Thank you. So I'm sure that people have a lot of questions. So I invite everybody to put their names in the chat, and then I'll call on you so you can ask your question to Jack. So maybe I can get started. Since you talked about, I can start with a play with the signifiers. You talked about the etymology of collapse.
Yeah.
So, of course, in collapse, in labi, also one thinks of labor, one thinks of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that what you have here, it's collapse coinciding with or produced by a working together, a sweating together. So there is a sense in which the sexual act is homologous to working together, to the kind of togetherness that is imposed by capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know how we would read this kind of etymological contradiction that the word points at. You can read it as, in a sense, an indication of the autoimmunitarian dynamic of capitalism. So that's laborare, working together, implies a kind of collapse, implies a kind of fall, and then looking at the sexual acts performed on the pier, maybe you can see that self-shattering as a kind of parodic push against the self-shattering that capitalism, enforces, or maybe even more provocative. And I think that you were going in that direction. These acts of gay male sex are not too different from working together in a capitalistic, environment, especially if you think that these buildings on the pier, they look like factories.
Mm. Yeah, but they're factories that have fallen into disuse and
That's
therefore,
right.
fall out of a capitalist market. They were precisely, the image of a post-industrial fall, and because the West Side Highway collapsed, no one could get to them, and that then created the possibility of a kind of free play of all kinds of activities that were no longer surveyed by the state or the city. And that was their promise. I mean, all the way through the 90s, I bet lots of people can remember that the piers were still there and young queer people hung out there. And if you go to the piers today, and this is why I did show the David Hammond's homage to Day's End, because it's quite a cheeky piece, really, given what's happened to the piers, which is a series of sports clubs, which, full disclosure, I do work out at the Chelsea Piers Sports Club. But every day I go there, I think about these piers and the histories that they hold that have been so completely capitalized, to the point that one of them is is this disgusting golfing range, and so Hammond's sort of almost forced the Whitney to put this very skeletal homage up to Gordon Matta Clark, probably for an enormous amount of money, that, as far as I can tell, no one takes a second look at. No, there's no signage on it. I saw it go up and I thought there'd be like a ribbon cutting or something. I mean, there was nothing. It's quite beautiful. But it's minimalist, and what it is a frame capturing nothing. That's exactly, it holds nothing. It is no longer industrial. There is not even the suggestion of the industrial. It does nothing. It is nothing. It almost disappears into the landscape. And I think it's actually very, very clever and beautiful. So you're right, Mario, that there is an interesting kind of transference of the labor that would have been the activity in the piers to the laboring bodies of the sexual workers. I do think that that's something to think about. I thought labi was from the Latin for slip. Is that not?
Oh yeah, no, in fact, what I'm suggesting, it's a pure sort of paretymological, provocation,
Yeah.
that the slip labor evokes laboro, which
Yeah.
means to work.
Right.
And so I think that going, along the lines of what you were suggesting, one could see collapse as a kind of dramatization of the autoimmunity of capitalism, but working in a sense implies its own collapse. That's all I was
Yes.
suggesting.
I'm not going to go head to head with you over Latin
No,
etymology.
but fine.
I
It's
know
not
I will
about
lose.
Latin.
So.
Yeah.
Lawrence.
As usual, thank you. This was amazing, and
Lovely to see you.
it's lovely to see you after a long time. I don't have a question quite yet. The question I'm leading towards is I guess as you end with this moment, which is all but existential, in which I have nothing, and it's with nothing that I can do, and it which made me think of the old debate of the old Sartre Levi-Strauss mid-century debate, where there's something like structure, and there's something like the human, which are put into an imagined settlement, and because it seemed that what the photographs did was something quite different, and it was the figure, but what you said were as if the building has intentionality, that made me think about that, and it was I'm trying to think of
Okay.
that moment of the movement, and how, for example, therefore Collapse does something slightly different, although akin to the figure of ruination that occupies a lot of contemporary thought, notably, say, Anat Singh. And but it's the sort of the way in which the activity of collapse, that the as if the building were moving, and how that stands tropeically or otherwise in relationship to the little humans is
Yeah.
so that's where the question would come if I was there.
No, you are. That's exactly it. That's so great. And it may be that the Le Guin is a little bit too humanist in its you know, centralization of a human project. I get where you're pushing me to go is to think more about these non-human ecologies. And I mean, I'm definitely, you know, reading Singh and thinking about these, you know, multiple other systems that we coexist with, some of which are organic and vegetal, but others we have, you know, others are part of a built environment that is decaying and falling according to its own principles, you know, and the principles of the other ecologies that neighbor them. And you're right, you know, I'm almost trying to confer upon the building a kind of erotic sensibility that because, for example, and again, I don't really care so much about Baltrop's intention, but he and Matta Clark, many days, according to Matta Clark's diaries, they were hanging from harnesses side by side with, you know, Matta Clark making his cuts and Baltrop making his photographs. Now, the thing is, if he was simply being a voyeur, he could have, I mean, I'm sure he had cameras that could have given us a better view, right? So there is an intentionality to the massive scale of the architecture and the diminution of the human. And again, particularly in relationship to masculinity, that feels very important to me, that he is invested in diminishing and in collapsing and in a kind of impotence that even the characters that we see having sex are often just kind of folded onto each other. There isn't anything particularly dynamic or hard about what we're seeing, or even particularly sexy. Or if there is a sexiness, it's ambient. And it's that ambience that I think escapes the logarithm, the grinder logarithm, which is attuned simply to, you know, abs, size of genitalia, you know, muscles. It's quantification of bodily sexy quotient, you know, whereas this kind of sexual ecology is offering us a different way of thinking about desire, potentially. I don't think I got there, but I think you're pushing me in the right direction.
Thank you anyway.
Elizabeth Abel has a question.
Yeah.
Hi. I had a follow-up question about the place of the water in these images of the pier, which often takes up almost as much space as the built environment, but didn't feature in your own discussion of the images. And I wondered if it could be viewed as a site of the other, of the non-human. It's neither collapse nor construction, neither something nor nothing, but some other mode, some other site of possibility, perhaps.
Yeah, that's so great, because of course it is a site, you know, we could call it liquidity, the non-solid, the reflective surface, which Matta Clark makes so much of in Day's End. You know, why is it Day's End? I mean, it has a sort of apocalyptic feel to it, but it's also because of the play of light on water, which then makes its way into Samuel Delaney's title for his autobiography, The Motion of Light on Water. So I think Elizabeth, that you know, the water plays a huge role in the way that the anarchitectural cuts function for Matta Clark. And I think I need to think about what it does in the photographs of Baltrop too. I mean, remember, he was in the Marines, so water is not inconsequential to him. And of course, you know, in the dance piece, that I was mentioning Anna Martine Whitehead's work. I mean, she's conjuring the middle passage and the falling into water. So there is a kind of, there's an evocation in the water of a different kind of history that I definitely think I need to find a way to reference. There's so much good work on water at the moment. I'll look around. I don't know if you had any immediate thoughts. I mean, I liked what you said about it, that it's not ground and it's not building, but it's also about light, you know, and since we're talking about an aesthetic, we're necessarily interested in how the light comes in. And then so many of those images where a man was just looking out of a window or lying near a window, the image seemed to be about the water and about framing the water as well. And, you know, this is of great interest right now in New York. For anyone who follows Eileen Miles on Instagram, you'll see that Miles is engaged in a huge campaign because the city is trying to develop high rent, high, you know, premium property where currently the East River Park is. And the East River Park is what the piers were some 40 years ago. It's a place that working class people go and play and walk and work out, and there are gorgeous structures there. There's all kinds of stuff, and the city's trying to build luxury apartments on it, and it is all about the water. So let me think more about that, because the water is, on the one hand, it's a kind of commodity, but on the other hand, it's beyond the commodity form as well. Yeah.
It's the dissolution of the commodity in part.
Yeah, dissolution is really good. Thank you.
So can I ask you a question about reparative and anti-reparative?
Oh gosh, okay.
I know it's
Sounds very representations, but yes, let's go there.
It's very thought, but yeah, you said that you think that in the current moment there is perhaps a need for an anti-reparative stance. Am I right? So
Yes.
I wonder whether you are suggesting a kind of third model, you know, beyond Spiegelman and Munoz, and maybe it's a relational negativity, or it's a positive anti-relationality. I don't know. So I wonder whether you can say something more about how you position yourself now in relation to that heated debate.
Yeah, and I don't think it's about relationality or non-relationality. I do think I'm saying, I'm sort of saying back to Jose, I know why you wanted to invest in the idea of world building, which was very much a Sedgwickian idea as well. And Sedgwick was, of course, Jose's mentor. And I get, I'm returning over and over to Cruising Utopia, as so many people are. I get why he needs to make that gesture, but that's not actually where his book goes after that. The place the book goes is to Harco jumping out of a window and a meditation on suicide, and why he affirmed that leap. He did not pull back from it. He saw it as a beautiful, he calls it incandescent gesture, but it's not reparative, by the way. And you know, even in those days where we were less quick to cancel people, Jose received a lot of heat for supposedly romanticizing suicide. And that's why he added the little bit at the end of the chapter where he said, oh, you know, a friend of mine actually killed himself when I was in grad school, and I was really thinking about this. He wanted to like say, I'm sensitive to how violent suicide feels to survivors, you know, but that gesture was very important to Jose. And all I'm saying is, I think it's pulling Jose in another direction, a direction that maybe would have played out differently had he continued, had he, you know, lived. And so I'm almost taking his half finished gesture and trying to run with it a little bit. And where it leads to is, and I know that it's not as simple as saying, we don't want a world make, we want a world unmake, but it is also as simple as that. Obviously, we have to figure out how to unmake the world that we live in. We can't keep repairing it and putting it back in the water, you know, the ship that we're on, it is going to sink, and we should let it sink. So the question is, why in the 1970s were people so intent on collapse and unbuilding, and why maybe should we be? And we know it was a very punk project. And by the way, Gordon Matta Clark, in a kind of early turn to the mushroom that precedes Anna Singh, was also deeply interested in fungi. He had a whole thing on fungi that I didn't even know about. So it was, these architectural projects were pretty connected to other sexual ecologies. And I know it sounds a little bit like I'm also being critical of a focus on gay male sex, but I am critical of only ever seeing gay male bodies having sex as some sort of path to liberation, because we have the hindsight now to see that actually gay men having sex is a very, very vital and lucrative path for capital. So we're going to have to find other ways to describe the impact of queer ecology, and it's no longer going to reside in a sex act. And so these sex acts, framed as they are by the drama of these empty collapsing buildings, is, you know, it's a bit of a gift. You know, it's an invitation to think differently, not just about the figure, but about the ground, the background. And that's, I think, what my project is trying to see. Yeah. And I see Carla has a question. Carla, do you want to say anything about that, or do you want to just stay looking, which is fine? Yay. You're going to come on?
I thought about Nan Golden in relation to Baltrop and what was happening at a certain period of time, and in particular also in New York City, and how, but she does center bodies, but she still does it in kind of a, yeah, I think a different way. It's not about the collapse of big structures, but it's certainly much more about collapse, dissolution, undoing, unmaking,
yeah,
rather than any kind of building project. Yes.
Yeah. But it is about the body, isn't it? About the dissolution of the body, the dependent body that isn't, again, it's a non-reparative project. It's not, oh, here are bodies on drugs and they're trying to get off drugs. Not even, you know, there's no sense that we want to move away from drug use. We're in it, we stay in it. So actually that's a really important reference. I'm surprised I hadn't made the connection. I think I'm going to go back and look at that. It is more on the body than I would want. Yeah, and that's what you're saying, Carla. But at the same time, dependency, I mean, I do think dependency is important. I think dependency is a super interesting lens for thinking about the relationship between those bodies in the piers and the architecture. You know, how are they leaning on each other in some way? That's great. Thank you.
Matt Grumbach.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a great talk. I kind of want to go back because in the beginning, I was interested how you posed it as like in some ways, a response to Douglas Crimp and sort of the way he, at least in my opinion, has kind of had a legitimating role when it comes to sort of queer art or art about AIDS. And it also made me think of like someone who's been left out as well as like Richard Hawkins. And he does these sort of sculptures that are actually like, you know, kind of like haunted old doll houses that are also in a way falling apart. But I do think he picks up more on this idea of like haunting, hauntology, nihilism, and I'm wondering sort of where you might situate that with, you know, this idea of dereliction.
Wow, thank you, Matt. I will go and look at those weird, creepy doll houses. That sounds really promising. You know, one has to give Douglas his due. I mean, people weren't looking at Baltrop's work. And yes, Crimp, this is what happens in an economy of scarcity, where there are not at that point, there weren't so many gay men to whom the art world was listening, despite the fact that the art world was completely, you know, crammed with gay male artists. And so Crimp did play that role. You're absolutely right. And he was such an important vector for Baltrop's work. But it means that then his commentary on Baltrop has formed the gateway to Baltrop's work. And you can see that in Jonathan Weinberg's book called Peer Groups, which is just along the same lines as Crimp. It's just like Baltrop was one of the great documenters of gay male activity in the peers. And here are his photographs alongside a whole bunch of other people, including Peter Huja and so on. And I just don't think that's the best use of these photographs. Can I just say that? You know, I think that looking at Huja's work and then looking at Baltrop's and looking at a whole bunch of people who were taking pictures of naked men in the piers at that time, there's such a difference. And also to classify Baltrop as a documenter, I don't think any of these photographs are documentary. You know, they're so beautiful in terms of these spirals and shapes, really. I would almost call them landscape photographs rather than thinking of them as, you know, having any kind of proximity to that other photography work of figures. So for that reason, yeah, I think probably placing this work alongside Richard Hawkins' work would make more sense. And I'm looking for these other more abstract renderings, because I do, and this is a weird claim to make for someone who is always, you know, pimping low culture, but I do think that there's something in abstraction that is able to escape some of the capitalization that we've seen in relationship to, you know, art world grabs into of certain art, like Mapplethorpe on the one hand, or you know, just gay imagery that immediately says it's gay imagery on the other, that has a kind of use value for the culture. So I really, you know, I'm interested. I want to find some other work that would stand alongside Hawkins, and I mean, like Hawkins alongside Baltrop. And I think that's a useful direction. You could see that I was looking for that in the Rachel Whitehead piece, which was so heavily critiqued. That was sort of interesting to me, because I thought it was doing similar work in thinking about these structures that hold, to go back to Lawrence's question, hold certain definitions of the human in place, and that we might want to dismantle in order to open onto some other formulations.
Lawrence.
Sorry, if no one. So I'm thinking again. It's not a question, but that's my mode. It's the about pornography, and it comes to me for a bunch of reasons. First, I have in mind, whenever I've given a talk in Detroit, I'm picked up by someone who says, "I will not take you on the Pornography of Runes tour," and of course we do that, and I'm such a position subject that it's pleasurable. Yeah. And but I hold that in part because I was trying to think about, one could argue that I'm trying to think about ultimately the mode of and I'm cautious about language because you've taught me how to think about this move of turning to the 70s in so many ways, and and so my language will fall short of that lesson, if you like. But but I had in mind, you know, in the idea of the documentary, that this is not documentary, as if that person might want to read Anjali Rondekar, or that is that they might want to turn to all that is that you cannot have. And then I thought, but of course there's a long line that would say, but those things are not documentary, they're pornography. And we know that pornography is a proliferation in some Roland Barthes sense around an absence. And it's we've been told that it's boring, we return. We've been told by Elizabeth Gross that there's a nothing to gay male sexual representation. There's so there's and I would accede to all that. So in some sense, I guess I would say that in contradistinction to that, these photographs announce themselves, and this is where I'm cautious, as an event, as opposed to as pornography, as opposed to as the presumptions behind the documentary fetish. And it's and yet an event with a difference, because one has to accede to your argument about nothing as opposed to something. And the question of so I'm trying to think about, again, I suppose it goes back to the question of the intent, the motion of the structure, but but I'm just really struck by the relationship of these images to their not being pornography, as someone who likes pornography but will accede to its critiques.
But what about, I mean, I like the idea of an event, but I also think that they're part of a process that we're watching, you know, and we're watching something that is, it's moving, but imperceptibly. I mean, collapse very often doesn't happen as an event, but is just a shifting on a, you know, a bad foundation or something, or one of the girders shifts, or something is happening in the earth that pulls the girders around, you know. I mean, it's actually kind of great to think about any shifts that may have happened in the piers having nothing to do with human intervention at all, but might be a tectonic plate or something. So I think maybe process. I mean, and I also hear you, Lawrence, like maybe there's not much mileage left in a critique of pornography. And this isn't, I mean, it's not a critique of pornography, it's just to say, is that really where the value of these images lie? And if so, why has he made it so hard for us to see them? Is the payoff, in fact, you know, elsewhere? Hi, Alan.
Hi, Jack. Yeah, I guess I'm sort of wondering about some of almost the day-to-day violences of photographing, like so a black man with a camera. And this might be easily answered by, you know, what lens is he using? But in some ways, you know, leading to those other questions of proximity and distance, of where he's photographing from, and distance being a viewer, not necessarily a voyeur, because I agree with you that these are landscape photographs, but proximity being a different kind of participant, and how much might be about practicality of walking around with the camera as a black man in New York on the west side, you know, of the piers, which, yeah, and the violences of that, I guess.
So you're saying that the distance is also protection?
But also the distance, but also the difference between carrying a telephoto lens and
okay, yeah.
lens.
Oh yeah, that's such a good point. Right. What you're willing to have on you in a space that is a bit lawless anyway. Yeah, okay. So in fact, it might, I really do need to know what, I should look into anyway, what equipment he was using, and think about the logistics of that and what that enabled and what it made impossible. And then, you know, what results from that combination of constraints and potential. And of course, you're thinking about it as a photographer, and I'm, yeah, okay.
Right. No, I was thinking exactly, and actually knowing what it is to photograph in those kinds of situations, and who approaches you, what kinds of questions, and the police are the first to approach you.
Right. Well, there are no police in the piers, which is one of the things that made it such an interesting space. They, you know, pretty much abandoned the piers to their own, you know, system and structure. But there were many other reasons that you wouldn't be carrying expensive photography equipment around there. So, but you know, what's amazing to me and what I would like to know more about is how he got some of those shots of Day's End, for example. I mean, I guess I want to know where he was located to get the shots, because it seems like, and this goes back to Elizabeth's question, seems like he'd have to be out in the water for some of those shots to pull them off. So yeah, I mean, his papers are at the Bronx. I have a student who said that he didn't find much, but there was someone else he had a lead on who had some other materials of Baltrops to look at that would tell more detail about how he thought about setting up the photographs and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it might be there might be numerous answers, because as you said, some of those shots I was thinking, is he standing on another pier with a telephoto lens?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Alan. Carl, hi, Carl.
Hello, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for a really amazing talk. You know, Times Square was one of my favorite movies when I was young.
Right.
And it was great to see that clip. And it kind of made me think about something that has come back in different ways in the Q&A, which is that the question of narrative temporality in the photographs. You know, one of the things that was so striking in the comparison or the juxtaposition of the film clip at the end is that the film clip, you know, it takes place in that same space, but it is really, what we're witnessing really is an event, right? You know, the arrival of the characters, the exchange of the blood, the forward-looking promise, right, of commitment to one another, a certain kind of care that's promised, right? But what's so striking about the photographs and the way that you read them is that the temporality of the figures, right, becomes almost fixed in the way that we often think about landscape, right? And the narrative temporality of the image really resides in your reading in the landscape itself, right? Both in terms of the signs of decay, but also the ways in which the image, though fixed, suggests a kind of movement, suggests this form of collapse. But also it made me think about all of these details that you kind of mentioned, right? The bicycle running against the side of the building, or even that umbrella, right? That's inside and, you know, got there somehow. So I guess it's not really a well-formed question, but I'd love to hear what you've been thinking about these photographs as forms of narrative, but forms of narrative in which it's really not the human figures that are key.
Yeah.
I don't know if that even really makes sense as a question.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think you can, the thing is, very often I do try to tell narratives, you know, and I'm very, I like to weave these narratives around, like, you know, silly texts and, you know, animated films and so on. And I noticed that I really want to resist narrative in relationship to these images. I think that's what you're picking up on. Like, I don't care why those men are there or what they're doing and whether they know each other's names and what particular sex act they engage in. You're right. I think I am instructed by the image to look for other things. And I mean, it's not just that the umbrella is there, it's that the umbrella is open and it's inside, you know, I mean, so its functionality has changed. It's almost like an electrical charge that's been turned the wrong way. And then the bicycle it's in a space where you would not be able to ride it. And it's literally going into the wall. And there's so much of that in the photographs. Those details feel to me to be the narrative, you know, or the non-narrative or the refusal of narrative. And they're what then allow you to go back to the human figures and say, I will not read this. And that, I wouldn't even have known to say that, except that the way you're framing the question makes me realize that I'm not looking for narrative. Whereas in a lot of the images that Jonathan Weinberg writes about, I can't remember all of the photographers, but in peer groups, I mean, it's almost like there's narrative attached to these figures. They want to be known. They're desperate for a kind of publicity, and here comes the camera, and the person is posing, and these men are not posing. They don't know that they're being photographed. And there's a kind of nonchalance about everyone, which maybe goes back to Lawrence's question about porn. I mean, I don't think it's not particularly pornographic because no one seems to be that invested in any of what they're doing, So what would, you asked about the temporality of it, and I'm interested in what the temporality would be where we have no narrative momentum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess it's just a kind of decay. We're in the space of decay and of a kind of inertia that's quite compelling.
Miriam Sam?
Yeah, maybe following up on this question of temporality that we're getting into here. Thank you, first of all, so much for your talk, and it's nice to meet you for the first time.
You too, Miriam.
On Zoom, which creates its own strange temporality because we're being recorded, and I could have watched you later, but I came, so might as well ask a question. Yeah, just thinking about the colloquial experience of walking around in New York, which I haven't done in a while. And, the beauty of, I'm sure lots of people have written about this, so excuse me if it's not a big deal, but, just there is something about that collapse and falling apart spaces in New York that is, maybe beautiful is the wrong word, for the feeling of time that it gives. Something about temporality that's infused into those spaces. And then I was thinking
any
about,
left.
Right. And they're getting erased. And of course, one obvious thing is that Grindr is about speed. So, it all happens like that.
Yeah.
Instantaneity, that's what capitalism is about, is how fast can it happen and how fast can it be over and be forgotten. So it seems like there's something about collapse that resists, maybe it's obvious, but that's not happening there. That's not instant. And it gives us that kind of sensibility. So thinking about the politics of temporality and in the visual field, but then I was also kind of intrigued by what happens when your talk moves from this gay male cruising image, which is so interesting and beautiful, with these tiny figures, which, normally a landscape figure would try to, or landscape photograph, like in Japanese landscape photography, political Marxist landscape photography, would just excise the subject altogether and allow the structures of power to become visible in the landscape itself. So then moving from that visual through the cinematic, and then there's the hint towards the musical that, you didn't give us, but I wondered what happens when we move into the temporality of sound from the temporality of the visual.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Miriam. I was also thinking about Turner's landscapes, where you need the micro, you need a glass to a magnifying glass to actually see the figures. And I think Baltrop that's the kind of sublimity of those photographs, is that the ground is so compelling that no matter how large the humans are in the photograph, they are reduced, and that's what you're then forced to look at. But with the sonic, I was trying to make a bridge from the girls yelling their names into the piers, and then the way in which the piers become an echo chamber for then thinking about a kind of sonic chaos that artists like Pauline Oliveros really embraced. And Oliveros was the perfect kind of sound artist of the background, because she listened to space. So she would literally record the sound of a fly buzzing, a motorcycle starting up, a tractor being pulled, a door being slammed, a bird chirping. And that was the soundscape that she wanted to enter into conversation with. So for me, you know, Pauline Oliveros is similarly like unmaking the kind of expectation about what women's music making will be, which at that time in the 70s was very much about harmony and acoustics and, you know, women with long hair strumming guitars, right, out in the country somewhere. And she, in fact, went into studios and hooked up tape recorders so that they would feed sound back and forth between each other and create loops of sound that were unpredictable. And there's one piece where she creates an unpredictable loop, and out of it comes what she calls a scream melody, which she did not create, but which the sound itself creates, much in the same way that Baltrop's buildings create architecture, her tape recorders create sound. And so that was the kind of the non-human sculpted artwork that I see in her kind of sonic architectures. I think it's very similar to these processes of decay that Carl's calling attention to in the, you know, non-human made forms of collapse and decay.
Okay, so it's almost 9 o'clock on the East Coast, so perhaps we should let Jack go, but I want to thank you again for a magnificent talk and for a great conversation afterwards. And we look forward to seeing the second volume of Wild Things.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everyone. These were
Thank
amazing
you.
comments. So generous. Thank you very, very much, really.